If your training is the first thing that goes when work gets busy, that isn't necessarily a discipline problem. It's just that when you're deep in it, you often can't remember what training does for you and how good it makes you feel. So it loses to whatever else is urgent that day. Now, the people I work with who never lose it aren't more disciplined than you. They've just stopped thinking about training as purely for health and started using it as a tool to improve their work. In this video, I'm going to show you what training is actually doing to your brain immediately after exercise and then for hours later, and the one thing that kind of undoes it before lunch. So let me start with why it's usually the training that goes and not something else, because I don't think it's the reason that people might assume. Now, everything else on your list on a Tuesday morning has got something attached to it. You know, someone's waiting on that email, the meeting starts at a certain time, the deadline has a non-negotiable date. Training hasn't really got any of that. What it's got is a real benefit. You know it works, but you can't really explain why or how. And that's the bit that really matters, because when you're under like proper load, proper stress, your brain gets really ruthless about that sort of thing, and it'll tend to prioritize what's immediate and specific over what's delayed and vague. That's not a character flaw, that's just how attention works. And when you've got a lot going on, training just happens to be the thing that looks quite vague and when you're in the middle of a hectic week. So it's not really a fair fight. You know, you're weighing up a meeting that definitely exists against a feeling that you can't quite put your finger on. And then eventually you do get a session in and you feel brilliant, and you kind of sit there afterwards thinking, like, why on earth did I stop doing this? And that happens to a lot of people. It happens to me all the time as well. And I do this for a living. Now, the contrast is a nice reminder, actually, of just how great exercise makes you feel. And, you know, I don't want to knock it, but I don't think it's the useful lesson. If the only time you're getting that feeling is every now and then, you know, after you haven't trained for a while, then it isn't an occasional bonus you're missing out on. It's that most of the year, you're working with a brain that's running way below what it's actually capable of. So here's what I've noticed about the people who never lose it. So they're not better than you at remembering how good it makes them feel. They've taken that decision out of it altogether. For them, training isn't something they do for themselves that's competing with work for time. It's part of how the work gets done, you know, in the same kind of way that preparing for a meeting is part of how the work gets done. And once you're thinking about it in that way, it doesn't have to win an argument with you every Tuesday morning. It's just in the diary with all the other really important things that matter to you. So an example of this is clients will often tell me that they've got a big meeting coming up, and if I can train them at maybe 6 or 7 in the morning before the meeting. Sometimes they're in another country and jet lagged, and they don't really want to do it. Nobody does that out of discipline. They're doing it because they know it makes them better in the room for that meeting that really matters. Right, so now let me explain what that session is actually doing for them, because this is the part that makes the whole thing reasonable, rather than just a nice kind of alternative way of thinking about exercise. So there's two things kick off almost straight away when you're training. Blood flow to the brain increases and you release noradrenaline and dopamine, which drive your attention, your motivation, and the executive functions that you're using to make decisions and, you know, hold your nerve when someone's kind of arguing with you in a meeting room across a table. So that part people half expect. You probably kind of know that already, right? But the bit I find generally interesting is how long it can hang around for. There's a trial in the British Journal of Sports Medicine that I really like, because they ran 3 different conditions on the same group of people and measured it. So they had 8 hours of sitting still, 30 minutes of moderate walking in the morning and then sitting still, or that same walk with short walking breaks throughout the day. Now, I'll put the whole study in this week's newsletter so you can have a proper look at it if you're interested. Doing the morning session improved decision making through an afternoon of just sitting compared with just sitting all day. And BDNF, which is the protein involved in keeping your neurons healthy and supporting learning, was still elevated 8 hours after that 30-minute walk in the morning. So think about it, 8 hours, that's your whole working day off the back of one 30-minute walk in the morning. And there's one more thing in that research that I think is really worth knowing, because I think it's probably the most useful part of it all. So the benefit is biggest in the people whose thinking is already struggling before they exercise. So if you're sharp anyway, a session adds less. If you're foggy, it gives you a lot more back. So on the day you've slept badly and you're already behind, that's the day it's doing the most work for you, which, of course, is probably the one you're most likely to skip. And here's the part that tends to surprise some people, because it's probably the opposite of what most people might think you should do before a big day. More isn't better. When researchers put different durations up against each other, the benefit doesn't just kind of keep climbing. It's around 20 odd minutes that seems to give you the biggest effect. And then past a certain point, it actually starts coming back down. I remember reading one study where going longer actually made recognition memory much worse. Intensity does something similar. So moderate work improves your reaction time. Hard work also improves your reaction time, but it costs you accuracy. And when you're in an important meeting, accuracy is more or less the whole job, right? There's not much point in being really quick if you're wrong. So if you've got something that really matters at 9 o'clock, 20 to 30 minutes at moderate effort is probably going to do more for you than an hour of intense training, which is quite good news really, because 20 minutes is something that you can easily generally get done anywhere, in your garden, at your gym, in a hotel gym, it doesn't really matter. Now, this is what I'd actually take away from all of this. And if you only change one thing after watching this video, I'd probably make it this one. In that same trial, the morning walk improved decision making on its own, but the short-term memory only improved in a group that also broke up the sitting with a few minutes of easy walking every now and then, which tells you something I think gets missed quite a lot. That morning session doesn't buy you kind of immunity from the rest of your day. You can do everything right in that morning session, and then if you sit completely still all day for 8 hours or whatever, you lose so many of those benefits. So the training session is one input, and not sitting for 8 hours a day is another input. And that second one costs you almost nothing, right? You can get it by taking a call standing up, going to get your own water, popping out for a coffee, getting up in between meetings instead of just kind of sitting there and waiting for the next one to start. And I'll add this as part of my job that isn't talking about brains at all. Sitting still for 8 hours is behind a lot of stiff backs, tight hips, bad necks. I see this all the time every week. So breaking it up is doing two jobs at once. You're protecting your thinking through the afternoon or the rest of the day, and you're saving yourself from a lot of pain and niggle later on. It's the cheapest thing on the list by a mile, and it's the one that hardly anyone even does. Now, there's a second version of this that runs the other way, and I've been using it with clients for years. Somebody comes in after work and tells me that their day's been brutal. I'm going to change the session for them, not to push them any harder, but to settle them down. The feedback I've had from this over the years from clients has been consistently really good, and the science also backs it up. I think, just a single exercise session can lower anxiety, and it blunts your blood pressure response to stress that you might have had through that day. So let me tell you what I actually do, because the type of session really matters here. So I'll slow the whole thing down. I'll often turn it into maybe a sub-maximal strength session. Nothing anywhere near failure, but heavy enough that they've got to pay proper attention, but light enough that they're in control the whole way. And then we're working on breathing, we're working on technique, and just making sure that they don't hurt themselves. And I think that's the bit that does the work. When you've got a barbell above your head or chest or whatever, you've got to concentrate on what you're doing. You can't just sit there replaying what happened in that meeting, wishing that you said something else to someone else. Your attention has got to be elsewhere. For that hour, you're focusing on the weights that you were lifting. I'll also usually put some breathing work in the beginning, or maybe even mid-set, between when they're resting. And then I might tie it into the stretching at the end. So slow breathing with a long exhale. That kind of breathing nudges you towards that recovery side of your nervous system. So it's doing a really important job in its own right. And it gives them something that they can use next time they're at their desk when the day's gone a bit mental again. The one thing I would say is don't smash yourself. A really hard session leaves you feeling Well, it leaves your nervous system more switched on, not less, which is the opposite of what you want in the evening. So done properly, the settling down comes over the next few hours, which is exactly the window before you go to bed, right? And what clients tell me is that they actually sleep better after those sessions and wake up clearer about the thing that they felt was impossible and was stressing them out the day before. Now, that one is just from kind of years of watching it happen rather than from a trial or anything, but it's consistent enough that I often plan for it. So let me bring all of that back together. So the reason your training goes out the window first isn't because you're weak or disorganized or badly disciplined. It's that in the moment that you're deciding, you can't feel what it does for you, and everything else on the list is kind of shouting at you. The people who never lose it have got around that, and not by being tougher about it or more disciplined. They've stopped treating training as the thing they do for themselves once work calms down and started treating it as part of the work, a 20 to 30 minute, just moderate session before an important day, and then not sitting motionless for the rest of the day. That's huge, that's it. That's the whole thing. And if you're only training when the week allows it, you're not just missing out on being a bit healthier. You're spending most of your working life not achieving what your brain is actually capable of. If you want a clearer picture of how you're training, sleeping, and recovering at the moment, and how that's showing up in your work, I put together a free 3-minute assessment that looks exactly this, and I'll put the link in the description below. And if this was useful, the newsletter is where I go deeper on this sort of stuff every week. And this week you'll find the trial laid out properly, and you can also subscribe for that below.